Welcome back to the Sankofa Pan-African series with me, Bomio Yinson. In this episode, I'd like to tackle the question, were ancient Egyptians white or black? While this question might sound nonsensical, it is one which has never been laid to rest, even within some academic circles. But we should, however, marvel at the ridiculous claims by some history books which ascribe the ancient Egyptian civilization to Hamites. These historians describe Hamites as, wait for it, whitish black people, in spite of evidence which shows that the prehistoric native Egyptians, both in the Old and New Stone Ages, were people who migrated to Egypt from other places within the continent of Africa, located south of Egypt. This implausible claim that the earliest Egyptian civilization was achieved by people who were not Africans is still prevalent, even in spite of evidence to the contrary, written in stone. The earliest recorded history of the origins of the Egyptian civilization are the Edfu texts, which records the earliest history of the Nile Valley and the origins of the ancient Egyptian civilization. Now, the Edfu texts record that Horus, who was the oldest pre-dynastic ruler of Egypt, came from an area which was south of Egypt after conquering other places in the south. Horus then moved northwards, and the people whom he conquered submitted to his rule. This ancient Edfu text narrates how, through this king who came from the south of Egypt, civilization was brought in the form of iron smithing to Egypt. His followers were known as blacksmiths because they introduced iron implements to the people that they conquered. In order to emphasize the relationship between ancient Egypt and other parts of Africa, E.A. Wallis Budge, who wrote extensively on ancient civilizations, points to several aspects of religion and customs of the ancient Egyptians that suggest that their original home was somewhere around Uganda and modern-day Somalia. Other researchers of remote antiquity have also written extensively to show that ancient Ethiopia had a population that was large and powerful enough to conquer ancient Egypt. And it did. We'll get to that in later episodes. Now, studies like the one conducted by Wallis Budge show complex interconnectivity between the ancient Ethiopian civilization and ancient Egypt. The ruins of old Zimbabwe, which are built in stone and bear similarities to Egyptian architecture, also prove the complexity and connectivity between ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. It is only logical to then assume that the Nile River must have served as a cultural conduit for taking aspects of civilization and culture back and forth between Egypt and its sub-Saharan African neighbors. As such, the Egyptian civilization, which preceded the Greek and Roman civilizations, cannot be seen to have been isolated from the rest of the African continent. Please don't be lured into thinking that this attempt to negate Africa's contribution to civilization is a thing of the past. Please take a moment and Google the question we're tackling today. Were ancient Egyptians white or black? One of the answers that will top the list on Google is one which claims scientists now know. And it's an example of efforts by people who are trying to prove that ancient Egyptians were not related to sub-Saharan Africans. The article claims that there is now DNA proof to show that ancient Egyptians were not black Africans. However, I beg you, take your time and read through the article, and you will discover that the so-called scientists who are supposed to have found answers to these questions were unable to find any mitochondrial DNA in the mummified remains which they studied. None of the remains which they studied was older than 1300 BC. And the fact that pre-dynastic Egypt existed between 5000 and 3100 BC, a period that is not covered by their research, does not stop them from making their spurious claim. They went ahead and to proclaim that ancient Egyptians were not related to sub-Saharan Africans. While I'm not trying to argue that Egypt was invaded and became heavily mixed over several centuries, and that present-day Egyptians have a closer affinity to Arabs and Persians as a result of the various waves of migrations, there is overwhelming evidence to prove that the original inhabitants of ancient Egypt were African. Please don't get me wrong. This is not an attempt to romanticize Africa and its contributions. Neither is this an attempt to exonerate Africans. It's apparent that Africans have been as steadfast in our own self-destruction as others who have over centuries colonized the continent physically and mentally. However, I know that Africans have as much inherent ability as any other people, and my motive here is to keep shedding some light on a more intricate history and reality of Africa, Africans, and Africans in diaspora. It is important to highlight their contributions to world-shaping events and celebrate women and men who have left solid but grossly ignored footprints.
If you like our series on Africa's ancient history with Dr. Bumni Oisan, watch more of our educative African content on the Sankofa Pan-African Series YouTube page, linked in the descriptions below. If you like informative and educational videos on Africa, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to catch all our latest videos. And please feel free to leave your suggestions, news tips, or topics about Africa you'd like us to cover.